Hello and welcome to Jive Talk, the Jive book review. Today, I'm going to be looking at this wonderful book, translated from Finnish into English by Aki Cederberg, and it's called Holy Europe in its English translation. But I'm not going to be just chatting about it by myself, as normal for Jive book review. I've actually got the author here with me. Welcome to Jive Talk, Aki.
Hello, good to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you on. Aki is famous for, especially in Finland, for his books, particularly this one and the previous one, Journeys in the Kali Yuga, which was about his journeys in India mainly and his spiritual exploration as a polytheist, a Western polytheist living in India and traveling in India. I first heard about him when I took a trip. I took a ferry from Sweden to Helsinki in 2017 and found an obscure bookshop on a back alley. And inside, the shopkeeper recognized me. He said, "Oh, I survived the Jive. You must read Aki Cederberg." And I was like, "Well, who is this person then?" And then he told me about him, and I wrote it down on a piece of paper, the name. And then a couple of years later, in 2019, I read the English translation of Journeys in the Kali Yuga, and I did a review on Jive Talk here, where I listed it as one of the best things about 2019. That was my favorite book of that year. It was very interesting because, like Aki, I had traveled in India, and not so much as a spiritual exploration in the sense of that he had of Hinduism, but more for myself, like my ancestry in India, like my ancestors come from India. But like Aki, I thought that he came to similar conclusions as him, that this is informative and useful for Westerners to understand as in our time of spiritual crisis. But the answers ultimately don't lie in India; they lie in Europe. And Aki said he was going to return to this problem of European spirituality with a book about Europe, and that's what Holy Europe is. Is that a fair assessment?
That's a very fair assessment. Yes.
And it's a wonderful book because it treats Europe as a holy land, the way a pilgrim would treat, a Christian pilgrim treats Israel, or some of these Western seekers going to India, see India as this ancient holy land. Well, Europe is an ancient holy land too. And especially interesting to me because many of the places he's chosen in the book are places that I've been to, and you may have seen them from my videos here on the other channel, on Survive the Jive. I went to Sintra, for example. Iceland, I just got back from. There's a little bit in England. There's a lot in Lithuania, the beginning of the Midsummer stuff that I did. I went to their Midsummer thing in 2015. So yeah, it's like seeing the world, my own experiences, but through somebody else's eyes. A very similar we have a similar background because we're both heathen, we're both polytheists, both come from a kind of Western esotericist traditions, similar tastes in general. So it was quite interesting to see. When did you begin Holy Europe? Was it like, had you finished publishing Journeys in the Kali Yuga when you began writing this book?
Yes. I had, they kind of overlay, there's some, Holy Europe kind of begins where Journeys in the Kali Yuga leaves. And so, yeah, there was a lot of, there's Uppsala and things, sites like this that I talk about in Journeys in the Kali Yuga that are also in the beginning of Holy Europe. So there was an overlay. And I mean, ultimately, I think they're part of the same work. Every author, every also artist, filmmaker, they kind of make one big body of work. And it's usually kind of just different facets of the same thing. So yeah, I hope someday these will all be published in like a massive, collection, because they're not really, they're part of the same story. It's an ongoing story, ongoing unfolding story. But whereas Journeys in the Kali Yuga represents about a decade of my life, so does Holy Europe. And so yeah, these take a long time, unfortunately, for me to write these things, because I'm one of those writers that I have to leave it first and then write about it, because I do involve my own subjective experiences in there. So it's like I want there to be the historical aspect and sort of the delving into these traditions on this more sort of general level, but also then going into the personal pilgrimage of actually going there. And I think you mentioned something which is central to my work, especially to Holy Europe, that I've always been annoyed when people speak of the Holy Land and they're referring to some other place than Europe. And I'm like, what is this place that you've never been to that's your spiritual center? And I think that's one of the most fundamental aspects and points of the whole book, is that our Holy Land cannot be, this is the biggest problem of Christianity, is that the Holy Land is always somewhere else than here. And it cannot, if you want to be a rooted person and you want to be deeply connected to the sacred, you have to be connected to your own Holy Land. And that cannot be some abstraction somewhere remote and far away. So that's what I'm exploring in Holy Europe. Yes. And of course, and I'm trying to view it in this light of everything that I learned exploring the Indian esoteric tradition, or the branch of Indian esoteric tradition that I was initiated into. Because I think there's a lot that we Europeans have forgotten, and that hasn't been preserved, especially in these sort of practical ways, in a way, how you do things and how the world is kind of viewed and operated with. And I think that was a very good teaching for me, which I then tried to apply in Europe, in the way I approach these things in Europe. But I've been involved in the pagan spiritual path since I was a teenager. Really, like my whole adult, and even before I was an adult, I was involved in these things. And in Holy Europe, I'm trying to sort of culminate everything that I've learned so far on my path.
Mm. I note that his previous book, Journeys in the Kali Yuga, was published in Finnish in 2013. It was quite a long time ago. For some of you younger listeners, this is a veteran of the polytheist and also a pioneer of this new genre in a way, which is pagan travelogue, holy pilgrimage literature or something. I'm not sure if that's a good way of putting it, but it's quite a unique invention as far as I'm aware of your own.
Somebody said it's like a pagan Kerouac or something. I was like, okay, that's not bad.
I find you've got much more. I think unlike Kerouac, you have a bit more of a focus. It's a little bit. Kerouac can be a bit disjointed at times. It's not so experimental in that sense, but it is pioneering in another sense. To give people an idea of what the flavor of the stuff, I just want to read a little passage from near the end of the book, because Aki, both his books, as well as being polytheist, is, as I say, an esotericist and influenced by some of the traditionalists who, and it's fair to say, like, you believe that we're living in an age of decline. And here this is expressed. According to tradition, we are living in a time of great imbalance. This is the age of the last cycle, when man has lost connection with himself, with nature, and with the transcendent. Everything that derives from this imbalance, all the upheavals, calamities, and diseases, are either consciously or unconsciously caused by man himself, and are a consequence of his fundamental lack of connection and sense of higher order. In the Finnish tradition, there is an understanding that as a result of some tragic event, man can lose his soul, his guardian spirit, or his self. I believe that this is what we are experiencing when faced with the crisis of modern Europe and Europeans today, and we have suffered a collective loss of soul. So, Aki, would you please explain how you think that pilgrimage, in this sense, might be an antidote to this malady, this problem of the West?
Yes. So I think that, as I said, as I wrote there, I think the fundamental problem that we face is a kind of soul loss, that we have sort of misplaced or lost part of our inner being. And so this book is called Holy Europe, and the holy here refers to the underlying essence of our culture, the spiritual metaphysical sort of dimension of our culture. That is the holy, the transcendent story. And where the transcendent and this greater story is manifested concretely is in the landscape, is in these holy sites, is in these crossing over places where we might touch or come into contact with the transcendent. Because we can talk all we want about the transcendent and about the holy, but if we don't have an experience of it, it remains kind of sterile. It remains an sort of an intellectual idea. So in the holy places, the sacred becomes manifest. It becomes real. And in the book, this is my approach: is that to try to be touched by this, I am physically traveling to these places and describing these sites. Now, these sites are not limited to strictly pagan sites. The whole of Europe is built on a tension between Christianity and paganism. And so the landscape also reflects this. So you can't be just like, okay, I'll just go to pagan sites, because in a lot of these places, the history has been interwoven, and paganism and Christianity has existed also alongside each other for a very long time. But these are the places that you can access something, maybe. And so this is my quest to find these places. And in the book, I've made this analogy many times, but the book has 9 chapters. And this is because I am exploring sort of 9 different worlds of the European world tree. So there's different, it's ranging from like the very north to the very south, and different aspects of that world tree. And I'm also trying to sort of define what the European idea is. I mean, what the concept of Europe means. Because I'm not limiting it to, or I'm not, just talking about Europe as a place, but also as something deeper. And I'm looking at what are the aspects of the holy that are uniting or that are in common with different European tribes. Because it's not all the same, of course. We have different families and different traditions in Europe, so it's not one thing. But I think that there's so much underlying similarities in the way that we perceive and approach the holy and how we interact with it, that these are the kind of connections that I am trying to point to in the book.
Mm-hmm. You do conclude, as I said already, that we're in an age of decline in which we lost this connection to transcendent. And you talk about this tension between Christianity and paganism that you just mentioned then. But and so since paganism is a much smaller religion than Christianity at the moment, it makes sense that the latter would be a force for Christianity will still be a force for helping to repair this connection, perhaps more so than paganism, if paganism remains as small as it is now. But you write about this need to accept the tension between Christianity and paganism, and suggest that a synthesis might be achieved. But how might such a synthesis be achieved when they're quite theologically and ideologically opposed?
That's a very good question. And I struggle with this so much myself. And in this book, I tried to not be overtly anti-Christian or something, because I just recognize it's such a fundamental aspect of European culture and civilization. And I find the whole, ongoing, these online debates between Christianity and paganism, and, it's so boring and redundant. And it's like, we don't need to sort of take these sides. This is not a battle that anyone can win, really, because both Christianity and paganism obviously are part of Europe, and they will remain so. They're not going anywhere. But Christianity has gone through changes, so of course I was trying to think of ways in which it could be reformed into something more rooted, but I really don't know. And I keep coming, this is something I struggle with greatly myself, because I think there's such fundamental questions at the very ethos, at the kind of fundamental aspects between Christianity and paganism. They're fundamentally so different in their basic sort of approach to life that I don't know if it's possible really to have a synthesis of it. I guess we just have to sort of accept this war, and just.
You do talk about the Grail mythos as a sort of potential. I guess when you're talking about like the Volian ideas of the Grail as a symbol that is a Christian symbol, potentially of pagan origin. So has the Grail mythos itself been useful to you for reconciling these opposing traditions?
I think the Grail is probably, it's among the most powerful European symbols. And it's one of those things which actually can and does unite paganism and Christianity. Because as a motif, it's something that pre-existed, and it was before the Christian aspects of it, and then it has this Christian layer on it, but it kind of combines things. And as far as symbols go, I do think it's a useful and it might be the most strong European symbol, because there's also equivalence of what the Grail is in these local pre-Christian pagan traditions. Like in the Finnish tradition, we have something that I think is sort of reminiscent of the same thing. And of course, I'm talking symbolically here, that what it is, what that Grail is, and because I don't remember if it's Evola who talks about that the Grail is this. It's a sign of initiation. It's where the sacred and the profane meet, and where man meets the transcendent, or man meets the divine, or man meets the gods. It's this moment of unity, which is symbolized often in the form of a cup. And a cup is something which you drink from, so you imbibe from the essence of the transcendent. So yeah, I think it's such a strong motif, and it's one of those things that does kind of represent this union of the thing, coming together of these things. And I think we can embrace these things as pagans,
Well, Evelyn didn't mention it, but one of the early Indo-European cultures of Northern and Western Europe, one of the defining things of them, which is they're named, both of them, Cordedware and Belbeek, are named after vessels that are so important in their religion that they have to be included in burials, and they were used to contain alcoholic beverages. But they were used in the burial rituals, and we don't really know anything more about the primitive Indo-Europeans' use of these vessels other than that they had to be included in the burials and that they were so definitive. But evidently that they had a divine association, and I've tried to, others have tried before me as well, to try and link these up with later Indo-European myths about a holy beverage, like the mead of poetry or whatever. But there does seem to have been like a divine alcohol ritual or something which was more than just getting drunk in a mead hall, and it was associated with death and with the gods. So in that sense, maybe the Grail is a continuation of something primordial.
Well, and that's one of these common aspects. And if you look at the Germanic tradition or the Scandinavian tradition, the Finnic tradition, the Baltic tradition, the more southern traditions, the Slavic traditions, there's always I would say one of the sort of combining aspects of these rituals that these different pre-Christian traditions have is the idea that it's often involves a drinking of a holy liquid, like that there's some form of holy drink that man takes part of and offers some of also to the gods. And the nature of that drink varies. Like in the Greco-Roman world, it's obviously wine, which is fundamental in the whole formation of that civilization and culture. And in the more northern part, it tends to be mead. And in the Finnic tradition, it tends to also be a special kind of beer or a mead. But it's often connected with it has a divine origin, and then man partakes in this and gives a part of it to the gods. And I think this is such a central ritual that happens throughout all of these European. This is one of those aspects I'm talking about. That like it's very similar. That there's always this a holy communion in a way, where you give a drink, you give a libation to the gods, and they then hopefully offer you some of these intangible things, kind of as a reciprocal offering. And also the drink itself is always more than just the wine or the beer. It always has this otherworldly quality and symbolizes the force of life and the life flow, which man then takes part of.
It's Soma and Halma in the East as well. Soma is so well preserved. There's a cult of Soma among the Aryans in India. But it's moved away from alcohol to a different intoxicant. But the general, relationship of this substance to the divine is the same as what you've just described. So it's probably primordial. I believe that the original drink was mead, because that's the oldest one, and I think that the Celtic and Germanic tradition has preserved that original one basically. And Slavic as well. I think they used mead, and Baltic too.
Yeah, we also in the Finnish tradition there's also mead, and mead is often also sung in this way, where it's also like it's not just a drink, but it's kind of like a flowing life force. So when in the Finnish traditions there's a lot of these songs, oral spells that you sing that are preserved, and in this you often evoke or invoke things that you sort of want to be manifested. And it's often via these analogies of a natural phenomena or something like that. And when you're invoking the life force, you're often singing about this sort of overflow of mead, of lakes full of mead. So it becomes the lakes and the rivers of mead are obviously not literal, but they're talking about this is the essence of life that's flowing, that's overflowing in power.
Yes, very interesting. I wonder, maybe you shouldn't go too much into it in this interview. We want to talk about the book, but I do wonder how much Finnish mythology comes from Indo-Europeans, because Finns have so much ancestry from the original Indo-Europeans in Finland, and also the Siberian migrants who brought Finnic languages to Europe had also encountered other Indo-Europeans adjacent to them before then as well. So it's quite possible. And I think that I've speculated before that this relationship of this drink to this holy drink that was buried with people and these vessels is something to do with the waters of the underworld, because there's many Indo-European myths where you have to get this water and drink it. And I think like mead is a symbolic version of the water of the underworld, these rivers of hell, which Indo-European myths often have the underworld as a place with waters in. And these waters, whether a river or a well, have something magical about them. And even a god or a hero will be involved in a journey to hell to get that water or mead. But going back to your book, in the conclusion, you talk about how your homeland, you as an individual, extends beyond Finland to all of Europe, kind of like what you were saying about you wanted to go from the Mediterranean far south to the far north. And what is it then that makes you a European? Because as I was just saying, you're a Finn, so you have this, you're European, but Finns also have this extra identity stretching into Siberia, which you didn't touch on in the book.
I think it is a shared sense of history, spirit, culture, and destiny. I mean, it is a story. In the foreword of the book, I kind of open the Finnish history a little bit to readers who might not be so familiar with Finland, because Finland is kind of a borderland. We are sort of at the edge, the very northeastern edge of Europe, and we are right next to Russia. And so we have to ask ourselves, like, what are we what are we part of? Which story are we part of? Where do we find ourselves at home? And Russia and the world East really kind of has a different story that we are related to, but that is not, it's fundamentally a little bit different. And I think Finland is here at the edge of world. It's always been like that. It's always been kind of this weird place, this liminal place a little bit. And what I'm looking for in this book is this sense of home. And I'm, this is one of the themes of the whole book, is a home in both a personal and sort of larger cultural sense, and what that means. And I think that means that when a person sort of finds the internal reflected in the external, and he can find himself at peace in a world which is familiar to him. And I think this there's a kind of sense of Europe. This is a kind of a romantic idea, perhaps, more than something I could draw on a map and be like, this is the defining, borders of Europe. But I do think it's a feeling, and you can especially sense it when you go outside of it. You can be like, okay, this is something different. This is a different story and thing I'm interacting with. Whereas when you get to Europe, you get that, I know this world, and this is what I'm part of, and this is my home. And I feel like that, and I've always felt like that. And I have a very deep love of Europe, and this book is a kind of a love letter to Europe, and to a Europe that could perhaps be if Europe sort of remembered itself again, and woke up a little bit.
Yeah, I feel the same way. Traveling in foreign countries in Europe is not the same as traveling abroad outside of Europe at all. And I know that there's some people that don't maybe understand the idea of European identity is very different from like Indo-European or Finnic identity. Like the idea that I would have a greater connection to Iran than Finland because they speak an Indo-European language is just not really, that's not real. It's a completely made up, like, intellectual concept. Indo-European languages exist and the Indo-Europeans existed, but the idea of like a modern Indo-European identity doesn't exist. But due to historical circumstances, like Finland has been, because of the Baltic, the geography, and because of the history that the Lutheran Church is tied to the West and the South. But because of the way Finnish nationalism has been a reaction against, Swedish imperialism, etc., it has sometimes resulted in people like Finnish nationalists wanting to tie their identity more to outside of Europe, to like Siberian peoples who speak a Finnic language. But my experience of Finland is, I'm not traveled in Siberia, but my experience of Finland is it's very much European architecture, European people with larger European ancestry with European character. But, how do you feel about that kind of Finnish nationalism?
I see what you're saying, and I think there's definitely a truth to that. I think it's been said recently that that Finns have only recently emerged from the forest and entered European civilization, and I think that might be true to a certain extent. We were one of the last countries, along with the Baltics, to be Christianized, and it actually took a long time, and there were several crusades into Finland because the Finns were quite persistent in their ways. The Swedes would come and convert us to Christianity, and then they would leave, and the Finns would taunt them and run into a lake. For instance, this is a lake I mentioned in the book, the Regret Lake, and wash off the baptism and return to their pagan ways. And so they had to conduct, another crusade to Finland to do this.
Interesting. But I remember there's another similar account from the Baltic of people washing off baptism. Yes. So it seems like a pan-Finnic Baltic sort of tradition was emerged of undoing the baptism, like cleaning yourself of it.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
So it's survived a long time here, these things. And what I always say is that, it might be true that we've only recently entered European civilization and left the forest, but the forest hasn't really left us. The memory of these things is still quite recent. The people keeping up this oral tradition were still alive, a few generations ago. And that's not the same in Sweden. or the rest of the Nordic countries, for instance, those traditions of paganism died out much earlier there, and somehow they survived here because this was a peripheral place and a small people. So these were kept alive longer here. And I think there's also like a common sense of a northernness. I mean, one of the common aspects between the Germanic tradition and the Baltic tradition and these things is a northernness. I think there's a maybe not emphasized enough, but there's a different spiritual tendency among people of the north than of people in the south. So I find there's all these layers to identity. Of course, I'm a Finn, I'm a Southern Finn, and I'm a Finnish person, and then I'm a Scandinavian, I'm a Nordic person, and then I'm, a Northern European. And these are like layers, but layers don't mean that they don't exclude each other. And I find this sort of isolation that some nationalists tend to have, I don't find it to be a very positive thing at this point in history. There was a huge cultural and historical need for Finland to have a very strong nationalism when it was being formed as an independent nation. And all these things, they were very, very important that Finns stood up and took their place and took their right to their language and independence and self-determination. But at this point in history, to only focus on a specific country is to disregard the overlaying unity and the commonalities that we have in terms of our destiny with other Europeans. So I'm trying to inspire this sense of commonality and fraternity among Europeans, and to see themselves as part of the same, different branches of the same spiritual world tree that we do share. We have so much more in common than we have dividing us. And I think Europeans have this kind of tendency to focus on the very minutia and the sort of little things that are true, that are different among us, but then completely overlook the larger things that we do have in common very deeply. And I think it's kind of Europe is still being born. I mean, it's not done. I think this is the time that Europe needs to rise up and become something. And even more in this world political climate, Europe needs to become something that it hasn't perhaps been yet. So I'm really much for a Europe as a cultural and political force at this point.
Yes, all identities are constantly negotiated throughout history and constantly, redefined, and it's an ongoing process. But I definitely think that Europe is a real existing thing. The Europeanness exists, and not just as like in our minds, because I once took a small boat from Turkey to a Greek island, and the difference was just immediate. Like, Turkey is a lovely place, but it doesn't feel very European, except maybe in parts. But then that Greek island, just a few, visible from the coast, when you're there, it just felt European. And I can't quite explain why, but it was, it's just different suddenly. But moving back towards the idea of the holiness of Europe and the religious aspect of your book and of these pilgrimages, you wrote several times about not wanting to just revive the dead religion of the past, or just taking empty rituals from the past, and it's sort of quite critical of an undefined type of modern paganism, perhaps, but forgotten symbols of the past and things like that. But for pagans, our religion and our sacred symbols do come from the past. The runes and things that you use and celebrate in the book are from the past. So what kind of revivalism is it that you want to avoid, that you're describing in the book?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's people always say the LARP stuff and everything, which kind of is a little tedious whenever Europeans celebrate any traditions which involve like arts and crafts and things, and people are always like, "Oh, that's LARPy," and I think it's a silly argument. I mean, this is our material culture, and this is material heritage, and I am not against those things of the past in any way, but there is a tendency of superficiality within paganism that's really strong, where we're only focusing on the outer appearance of a certain period in time, and we're imitating the life ways of, say, some villager hundreds of years ago, living in a completely different time and situation, and we're neglecting the inner essence of those things. And I think this is what I'm saying, like if something is real, the inner essence needs to take new forms. It can't always be looking backwards. There needs to be an aspect of something that looks to the horizon again. I mean, I always quote Ezra Pound, the American poet, because he kind of did this. He was very rooted in the Greek traditions, in the Greek Homeric legends. His cantos begin by retelling some of these. He was primarily rooted in those things. Then he was rooted in the troubadour traditions of the Pyrenees, where he traveled by foot and collected all this, poetry. And so, yeah, these are two very strong pagan streams in Europe. But he said, make it new. He was a modernist poet. So he believed that if the inner essence is there, the form needs to be new. There needs to be creativity, new, exciting, vital forms, and not just this sort of role-playing or imitation of things of the past. Because in these, most people, when they're looking for answers to difficult questions in life and a deeper sense of meaning and all these things that religion kind of serves, they're not necessarily looking for, to dress up in a certain way and have like the external appearance to be the first thing, but they're actually looking for the inner essence of things. And I think there's been way too much emphasis on, maybe it's just what I've been seeing, but I think there's been too much emphasis on the external instead of the internal. And in this, like I've seen this in some Finnish groups, for instance, where it's like everything is in past tense, and every thought is sort of told in this way that this is what these people used to believe. Well, we are those people. Like, we should say what we believe now and not talk about it as these people, some in the distant past who did this, because it's kind of disjointed. Because we are those people, we are our ancestors living right now. So if these things are a reality, they need to be sprung up from sort of an internal well and take new forms, vital forms. And of course, I'm also.
And you think that's art?
Yes.
This new form, the new forms that it should take will be artistic expressions, I suppose, because you give a lot of room for artists in the book. It's not just about, as you say, not just pagan holy sites. You talk about D'Annunzio in Italy, who's very keen on a cult of art, and Ezra Pound, and these kind of artistic eccentrics, which aren't directly associated with Europe's holy places. But I guess you see these as important for the book because they represent a method by which the holy might be rediscovered.
Yeah, I mean, who were the singers? These are the singers of our time. These are the people manifesting the divine with their songs and their art. And it's always been the artists who have manifested the divine, whether they be storytellers or, whatever. But we have to also recognize who these people are in our own time, because these are the people that can really manifest the divine to us through their works.
I'm going to go to Germany this summer to make a new film. And I've decided I'm going to be northern Germany. I'm like trying to do a sort of pilgrimage, because I do these pilgrimages for video form. So that's my art form, documentary. But I'm trying to find the roots of the English in northern Germany. But also inspired by your book, I want to go to the Kunststätte Bussard, which is one of the locations that you visit that is not an ancient holy place, but it's an artistic, a modern art place that is inspired by ancient Nordic mythology and things like this. And in this case, in Wagner's medium of total art, which I think like at the time, Wagner thought opera was total art because it encompassed different forms of art together. But I think cinema is the current contender for the greatest medium for total art, as far as I can see. But yes, would you like to see more such projects like that? How do you say
Kunststätte-Bossard.
Kunststätte-Bossard. Would you want to see more things like that for Wagnerian total art, or how do you imagine it might manifest in the future?
Well, all of the artists that I speak of in the book, I mean, they draw on this well of European spiritual tradition. They're all drawing from the mythos. They're not taking these ideas to what they're doing in a vacuum. They're taking, they're often inspired directly by the gods. I mean, Bossard was inspired by a period of blindness where he identified with the god Odin, or Wotan in Germany. And he has a whole place called the Edda Hall there, which is all inspired by the Nordic myths. And there is the majority of the artists I speak of, they're always rooted in tradition, but they're expressing it in a new and vital form. And yeah, of course, I think that's vital to a culture, and a spiritual tradition also really surviving is that it produces sort of new life in the form of art. Because art is really the way that we relate to the cosmos around us, and how we can create a sort of harmonious coexistence with the world is to have a sense of harmony between nature and man and the divine. And usually these Gesamtkunstwerk type places, you know, where I include a lot of these places in the book, besides ancient, holy places and churches and temples and such, because these are really sort of the modern manifestations of how spiritual tradition can manifest itself in physical locations where artists build shrines that are rooted in the tradition. And these are incredibly inspirational places, I find, because this is where kind of the religion takes its form. And Europe is full of these places. We just need to sort of recognize that these do exist. And and you know, I read a book about Wagner, because people sometimes say that Wagner was misinterpreting the myths and all these things. And Colin Cleary wrote a book about the ring cycle, where he actually says that Wagner was actually a bard, that he was continuing the tradition just as the ancient singers would have, and that this is actually the most prominent modern manifestation of the myths is actually Wagner and his cycle. Now, I think it's something to at least think about and take into consideration. And but I do found that this is how we the holy is repressed, takes new forms to us via art, via these things that you can experience. And having experienced, for instance, the ring cycle myself, I mean, they are kind of religious experiences, because you spend so much time in this dark place and you just immerse yourself in this myth. And there's something truly profound, I think, in those.
Yes, I've attended two operas from the Ring Cycle, and yeah, I did have it did feel like a religious experience. I think his music is divinely inspired, but at the same time, I also do say that the people who criticize his interpretation of the myth, I think they have a point, because his ultimate belief is that the gods had to move aside for man, which I think that's a very modernistic view, and I think that's what we need to go. That's what we need to move past if we're to rediscover a holy Europe, right. Really. But I mean, he's definitely an amazing artist. And I even once in 2012 attended a bloat where they had a CD player and they pressed. They had something from Wagner's opera to like bring people into the sacred thing, which is very modern, but it did kind of work. Actually, it was an interesting way of doing it. But how did you, I mean, going back to Kunststätte-Bossard, did that feel to you, how did that compare, for example, to going to an ancient barrow and pouring out libations? Like, did you feel the sacred in this art installation, art gallery place? Well, it's not gallery, but in this total art creation?
Well, these places vary, and these gardens in a way, they're kind of these sort of ideal. They're sort of images of the divine, and we can sort of immerse ourselves in the image of the divine. But maybe they're not the same, though, as some holy place, which is ancient, perhaps, because usually the holy places lie on markers in nature. They're connected to something that man has found there very early. I mean, if you look at where European holy sites are located, they're always located where there is a strong presence of some kind, a mark of nature, whether that be a mountain, a river, a lake, a sacred grove, a cave, a tree. There's always a powerful presence of nature in that spot where the holy site is, because it is thought that not all places are the same, and places have a personality, they have a spirit. In Finnish, we call it a haltia, that there is some sort of spirit or guardian which you should and can interact with, and which can touch you in places. So in some places where you go which are ancient, it's a different experience than going to some, art garden that's built in the last 100 years or so, where the art can be very impressive and the experience can be very inspiring and immersive. But it's a different kind of experience, I would say, too, from these ancient places, where they can really touch you in a different, deeper way, where it's unexpected. Like, you really don't expect to be touched in this visceral way. And that's rare for me. I mean, I'm not some very sensitive person or something, so I don't feel things constantly or something. And I talk about this also in the book, that, often we travel to these sites and we have a feeling that we should feel something, but we're not getting it. And we feel a sense of disconnection. Like, if we're honest, we're like, okay, something happened here, I should feel something, but I don't know if I do. And there's a sadness to that. But then there's moments where you go somewhere and completely unexpectedly, it's like something touches you. And I've experienced that a few times, perhaps. I mean, it's kind of rare. But those things are the kind of like the ultimate that you are looking for, is what the Indians call the darshan, the beholding, where the divinity actually manifests to you in some very concrete and sort of unfathomable way, where it's not an intellectual exercise, or it's not something you can really like prepare for, but it's actually something that feels transcendent. So I think there's a difference between the artist creations and things that have been, that have markers of nature.
Yes. And for those pagans listening, it is, I know, especially disappointing when you have put a lot of effort to go somewhere and you don't feel that divine presence, or if you've actually felt divine presence in a place before and then go back again and don't have it the second time. But that's just how it is. It's sometimes there, and sometimes you get it, sometimes you don't. But I mean, one of the exceptions I kind of felt, because I usually acknowledge the distinction you just made between these like modern places that might have some pagan relevance than an actual ancient holy place. But when I was in 2021 during the lockdowns, I went to Sintra into the gardens that you went to. I can't remember what they're called, Regalia.
Quinta da Regalera.
Regalera. And when I entered the cave from above, and then the spiraling staircase down this shaft into the underground, and then into the darkness, and then you come out again and emerge in the light. Now, I know that this was built by an eccentric aristocrat, not by ancient pagans, and that his beliefs are probably very different to anything I had. And there was even like COVID stewards, like making sure you didn't take your mask off when you went inside, all very profane and unpleasant modern kind of associations. Nevertheless, the effect of the architecture, it affected me very deeply, this process of moving through this environment. And I imagine that is the kind of architectural techniques or like processes that were used in ancient rituals. For example, in Greece with the cult of the Eleusis, there was a similar like movement through this building from darkness into light. So did you wrote about that same place in the book, and I mean, how did you feel, and how did the impact of this quite modern architecture affect you?
I think that's a good example, and I think Quinta Regaleira. I mean, it's the place that you describe is called the Initiation Well, the Well of Initiation, Poco Iniciado. It's debated whether the order that you should go in there is actually from top down, because kind of if you look at the esoteric traditions that they were involved in, perhaps that built that place, it would have been the other way around. It would have been that, visita interiora terra. How does it go? Visit the interior of the earth.
I didn't have the choice because the COVID stewards made us all go.
Yeah. But I think the proper way to do it is that you enter the garden and you enter these caves and you wander in these caves first, and then you come to the bottom and you ascend and you come up at the top of this thing, and not the other way around, I think. Anyway, when I was
either way, you go from darkness to light in either case.
Yes. And in a way, when you enter from the top, you enter the garden of earthly delights. When you come out, you come into this beautiful garden. So there is that aspect too. But when I was there the first time, and this relates to an aspect I also write about in this book, is this kind of idea of solastagia, as opposed to nostalgia, that the place is still there, but the physical, you can visit a place once and then you visit it another time, and although the place is still there, the experience of that place has for some reason been so much altered that you cannot experience it anymore. It's not accessible, and so it's kind of like off limits. The gate has been closed, and that's the way Quinta da Regaleira has become for me, because I've visited it twice after I wrote about it the first time, and the first time I was there was well over a decade ago, where you could just wander there by yourself. There was no restrictions. A lot more of the caves were open that are open these days. It was like a mystery garden, and you could just take your time, spend the whole day. It wasn't very much people there. You could just wander around, and explore and do things. And then coming back, 10 years later, and I went there also. I think I went there shortly after you did, actually. And then suddenly there's like, you have to just only enter from one way. There's a line like going into like a nightclub, like with a doorman. And then there's like hand spray, like hand sanitizer by the entry to the initiation cave. And it's just ridiculous. It's like, this is so far from an experience of, what this used to be, that it was like almost, it was inaccessible. And it was very sad in a lot of places. Like, now this is a problem, and I think this is something that I think should be paid attention to, is that we should view these places, whether they're ancient places or current places, as what is the purpose of these places? What was the experience that they were supposed to allow for the person entering? Now, of course, in the term of something small like the garden that we are talking about in Sintra, that was probably not meant for more than just a handful of people, really. It wasn't meant to be a site for mass visits. So I understand there's a problem where it's supposed to be some esoteric experience for like one person, and then there's tens of thousands of visitors daily. But at the same time, we shouldn't view our ancient places of historical value as only historical places. We should still treat them and try to access them as living sacred places, and then in this way, I think it's good to look at how Indians, how they approach holy places, little shrines and trees. They always approach them as a holy place and give offerings and with respect, and they do the process as it should be. And we Europeans, instead, we approach them as, something happened here in the past. We have no idea what it was. People are excavating, and we can't know really anything they did, and we shouldn't. Like, this is the way that even Uppsala now, I was there in Uppsala by the turn of the year, and I noticed that it has become forbidden to go up on the mounts now. Like that there's signs saying up that you shouldn't go up on the mounts.
they had to do that because to let the grass get back on it. I think like they fence them off for a while, but then they'll let people back on eventually. I hope.
Well, this was in the winter when there was like a meter of snow there.
Oh,
So-
or people toboggan in the winter on I go in there in the winter and I've got video of that, like children tobogganing on it, which is cute in a way, but also kind of maybe not as respectful to an ancient king as is appropriate, but shows the changing attitudes to it, to the barrows.
But I think in a way it's this idea that we need to be able to access these places. We need to be able to go to them and commune with the divine as the people of the past did. They in a way, a lot of holy places become sort of historical, sites, and they're so heavily regulated that you cannot access that place anymore. And I understand that it's a problem when things become, too famous and like, there's too many people visiting, it becomes a problem. But yeah.
Yeah, it's a problem, especially for us pagans, as well as for Christians using some of the ancient places, because on the one hand, it's like an active religion taking, a religious site, but also many people want to see it just as a historical place and they need to be given access. And there's some, to manage something like that is difficult. A lot of these cathedrals now in Europe, the ancient cathedrals start charging entry, which probably is theologically forbidden. I don't think you're allowed to charge entry. I don't know the Christian theology that well, but nevertheless, but if you say you're going in to pray, then you can go in for free. Similar at Stonehenge, you have to pay £25 for access. If you just walk around the side. Yeah, whoa. £25. So it's like €30 or something like that. But you can get for free if you just walk around it and park on the thing. It's free to get. But if you are one of these neo-pagan kind of druid people, dubiously authentic forms of polytheism that some people practice, they are given free access to the site, to party there, basically to having a rave at the midsummer and midwinter solstices, which is good that they're making those allowances, but that's more of a concession to like the New Age movement and its protests in the 80s at the site, rather than to an actual historically attested form of paganism there. But then again, like we know that different forms of religious rites took place there over the years. They changed over time. So perhaps this raving is just the latest iteration, although it doesn't seem to me very religious. That's just my interpretation.
Indeed.
But going back to like the non-conventionally holy site of the book, another thing you give a lot of space for besides artists is sort of people who are adjacent to or associated with like the art of the National Romantic period, and even later on Nazi adjacent esotericists like Otto Rahn and Carl Willigert. How can they inform the spirituality of European peoples? Because you clearly take an interest in them, and earlier ones, presidents like Aleister Crowley as well. You mentioned doing a reading of Crowley for a deceased friend. Many would reject them, if not for political reasons, because they aren't necessarily following authentic traditions. Kind of like if you're like a polytheist and you want to be like authentic or a traditionalist, you might be wary of the theosophists or some of the National Romantic ideas, or some of the Nazi esotericists. So, do you think they represent a hazard, or is there something that we need to look at there that was perhaps interrupted by the war due to overzealous denazification that we need to recover and continue?
Yeah. Well, the Crowley thing is just, I mentioned that because my deceased friend was a student of Crowley and stuff. So I did it more in sort of in honor of him than as a personal, I'm not trying to mix in Crowley and all these things. But obviously, I've been involved in these things for such a long time that I've been brewed in many kettles and read a lot. And I think also Crowley as a person, or as a phenomena, you have to kind of take him into account on some level. But yeah, then coming to the German stuff, I mean, the German chapter of my book called Lebensbaum, which means Tree of Life, is probably the longest chapter of the book. And that was the most kind of heavy one, because obviously you cannot approach, the subject of paganism or such things in Germany within 1 minute of coming face to face with the past involving the Nazis. So I had to treat it. I had to deal with that subject, and I was trying to do it fairly in a way where I would try to sort of see what they were doing in an honest way, and to portray them in an intellectually honest and well-grounded way. Also to look at why people nowadays are attacked, because this whole sort of weird Nazi occultism is a weird current phenomena that people are drawn to. And I also wanted to sort of deal with why that is, what it is that makes that subject matter and that area so alluring to a lot of people. So I was trying to be fair, that there is an allure to, there's certainly a magnetism to a lot of that stuff, but why is it? So I was trying to deal with that and like to deal with the weight of these things in Germany, traveling around to these places, because it's such a heavy shadow that history casts on that subject matter, which ultimately still represented a very short, very explosive time in history, but considered quite short, and certainly wasn't like the main agenda of the Third Reich to to further these things. It was a quite liminal phenomena, and they were also interested in these things as much as they could use them. They had a very specific ideology, which really isn't paganism. So it wasn't like paganism with tanks, as some people imagine. Like, it really wasn't that. It was a very modern ideology that it could use aspects of romanticism of the past to further their aims, and obviously they did so with great success, in terms of their aesthetic use of things. So it's just a subject you cannot avoid dealing with, this subject matter, and there's crossover a lot with this stuff. So, and dealing with Evola, and if you're dealing with Evola, then you're also, Villigut was kind of involved in rejecting Evola and all these things back in the day, and so there is like crossover a lot in these things. And I think we have to try to be clear-sighted about what that was and what actually paganism is, and what the tradition really is, as in opposition to kind of a German early 20th century occultism, which was still really heavily influenced by theosophy and all that, and was very like tied to its time and the phenomena of its time. But I was trying to explore this whole difficult subject matter in a way to bring it to light in a fair way, instead of being moralist, because there's so much of this like silly Hitler black magician kind of stuff, which is just yeah. So it's just become a pop culture thing now. So yeah.
Well, it's good that you addressed like something like Wewelsburg Castle having that design, the Sonnenrad from the Zielscheibe, a variant based on earlier Zielscheibe, because it's in the news now because Danzig from the Misfits has released a new T-shirt with this sign on it, and it's caused a lot of controversy. But this is just like one little thing that was put on a mosaic in a castle somewhere, and now it's become a much bigger symbol in the post-war era and much more widely used than it ever was in Nazi Germany. And even in the pagan era, it's just like a few little dangling brasses that women wore on their dresses for some reason to protect them from evil of some kind. But now it's like, well, it can be a sign of paganism, a sign of Nazi sympathies. It's certainly, and now a sign of heavy metal music or whatever for Danzig as well. But it's quite interesting how that changes. So it had to be addressed. But I think, it's fair to say that the Nazis weren't pagan. They just used some Germanic pagan aesthetics. But when you're talking about these esotericists who are adjacent to them, like Otto Rahn, it's something else. And like you use Otto Rahn, you address Otto Rahn not in the Lebensraum chapter in Germany, but I think when you go to the country of the Cathars, where I've also visited a lot of those castles, and the Pyrenees, I guess he was in those areas as well. But did you find that his frankly, often like, wrong ideas about what the Cathars were, useful for understanding the spiritual significance of Languedoc and this region, the Valley of the Dordogne in southwestern France?
I mean, he's certainly. I mean, he was a poet, first and foremost. So yeah, I think, of course, he got things wrong, and I think his view of the Cathars is quite different than what most people nowadays would say that Catharism constituted. But he still visited a lot of those places, and he wrote a lot, and he collected a lot of very interesting legends and things. And he was some of his writing is pretty good, and his life story is fascinating, and it also relates to this idea of the seeker, which is one of the motives also in that chapter is the seeker. And it doesn't mean that if you're a seeker that you always find and you end up in the right place, because the seeker can also end up being sort of consumed by the quest itself. And I was talking here about several individuals who were exploring areas of prehistory and mythology when they were very young, because this included also the Finnish figure Yrjö von Grönhagen, who stayed with Villigut and was very good friends with Villigut and was asked to sort of take care of Villigut because he was getting old and drinking too much wine and had health problems and things. But it's interesting to see what happens when these people they're very idealistic, and they're, I think, genuinely good souls seeking things. And then they're put into this position where a big state power, they're of course completely broke, nobody has any money, and then they're like, here comes some very influential person who's like, I'm going to give you unlimited resources almost to go travel and find the Grail and find these things, And then obviously at some point they become entwined in the battle between two world serpents where you cannot escape unharmed. And yeah.
It could happen to you or I. If either of us were offered a massive grant by some government, I imagine you would say yes. I'd say yes. But then obviously if that government went on to do questionable things, then you have to be associated with those things by having accepted that. But artists need money. They need to get what they can, I guess. But I'd like to just quickly recommend, because a friend of mine has a neofolk project called PYHÄ Newman, and he lives in the Pyrenees, and he did a whole extracts of Otto Rahn, readings of extracts.
Martin Luther,
Lucifer's Court, yeah. You know him. Yeah, it's a good neofolk album about the Otto Rahn's experiences of that region of the world. It's quite an interesting creation, actually, of artistic exploration of that whole thing.
It's very good. Yeah, I recommend people go listen to it. You can download it for free. I think it's called Lucifer's Court, and PYHÄ Newman is the project. And he does a wonderful reading from Lucifer's Court, which was the second book by Otto Rahn, and he does really great musical soundscapes to accompany it. But I mean, all of his work anyway is really good, so I recommend people check him out. And there's a book coming out about Otto Rahn very soon by Richard Stanley, who's this movie director, and he did the movie about Otto Rahn, the documentary called Secret Glory. And so he's done decades of research, and he's putting out a pretty lengthy book about Otto Rahn now in English, which should be out in a few months, I believe, on Inner Traditions.
Keep an eye out for that. And I also recommend people do visit that area of the Europe, because it's stunningly beautiful. It's a really lovely part of the world. It does have you say in the book, it has a kind of magical feeling. I can't explain it myself. I did a video called Cathedral to Cave, where I show that area, and I compare the Albi Cathedral is the built for the Albigensian Crusade to the rock Paleolithic cave art inside the nearby mountains. So it's you've got this huge span of history, tens of thousands of years, all in this little area, and there's something very mystical about the area. I don't know if it's from the prehistoric Ice Age hunter-gatherers or the Templars or the Cathars or whatever it is, but it's there, and it's a palpable sort of energy in a lovely part of the world.
Yeah, and that's really one of the places again, like that you can access something in, because it feels a little. That's one of the places that I've gone back to, and that I really feel drawn to go back to again, because there's a strange sense when you go there. It's like it's wild and sort of untamed, and these places are really accessible. They're often, if you won't go to the holy places and sacred places there, they're not on maps. You have to kind of know somebody who will take you to these places, or at least tell you where they are. I mean, I had a hand-drawn map, for instance, that I was following to go into certain places. Like, literally, somebody I knew drew in my journal like a map of places, and I followed and went to these places. And I think there's a strange sense of wildness and sort of freedom, but also danger there, because there's no safe rails. There's no like elevators and tourist centers. It's pretty sort of, you can access these wonderful places without the safety net. And you also feel
Some
like
of the
you're
castle's
sort of
a bit scary to go up the castle, because you feel very high up, and you're on like an 800-year-old building just standing up the top of a mountain. Very odd feeling.
And it's not this over-regulated, protected kind of sense at all. It's like you're really in these places, and it also sort of feels like you're sort of a little bit outside of the modern world. You know, the cell phone doesn't really reach that well, and you're like at a distance from the modern world, and really it's a wonderful experience. I really found a lot of solace in that. The Pyrenees are a wonderful part of Europe, really.
They embrace their medieval heritage a lot in that area. Like, they go all out for it. I remember I went to a Renaissance medieval fair in Court Saucier in that region, and then the whole town was decked out like a medieval it felt like a medieval town, and medieval performers doing medieval music all over the streets, and people wearing, it was like the whole town suddenly became medieval. But it's a lovely place to go.
Yeah, this also relates to, sorry to give you at this, but I do think it relates to one of these things we talked about earlier, relating to the ancient sites in Uppsala, Gamla Uppsala and such places, that, you know, there really are these sites there that can really touch you. Like, what is that thing? What is the thing that Romans call the genius loci, the spirit of the place, or that we call the guardian spirit in the Finnish tradition? That if you approach these places there, there's something in that place where they seem to be more easily accessible or something. I mean, when I went to, I described this in the book, when I went to Montségur, the Cathar castle ruin. I didn't expect anything. I went up there, and the place really did touch me profoundly. And I wondered what it was. What was it? Because it wasn't only the beautiful landscape and the sort of historical tragedy. I don't know, but there's some places do have a kind of tendency to be able to touch you in a really profound way. There was a writer who said that it's because of the history that there's all this sadness that's stuck to the place, and so people whose souls are kind of stolen or something, they find resonances in that place. I don't know, that was a pretty poetic way of putting it, but I did find there was something deeply moving about that place. And such places.
Montségur, yeah. One of your friends had a vision, didn't she?
Yes. I had a Finnish friend who's, incidentally, she is a student of Finnish sort of traditional shamanic traditions, not the colorful drum variety, but the sort of original shamanism of the Finnish tradition.
They're called Noidi, or is it Noidi?
Well, Noita is just an old word for sort of witch or shaman, yeah. That comes from these old things. But she had been taken there by a friend just on a tourist visit, and she had no idea about any of the history. And she avoided sort of researching things in advance because she just wanted to experience things. And she told me about this experience that she had there, where she really had a severe breakdown and heard people crying and singing and all these things, and then only when she read my book did she realize the history of that place. And so she had really like touched on, like, had an experience of something that had happened there a long time ago, apparently, and then but didn't know about it in advance. So, these places, I'm sort of open that places can speak to us, and that there
I
is.
should tell you, I wanted to say an anecdote of similar. The first time I visited that region was in 2007 with my family on a summer holiday. My little sister at the time was about 10 or 11. I can't remember, maybe younger. But she said when we visited, I can't remember if it was Montségur or one of the other castles, she said immediately, a lot of people died here as soon as she got there. She didn't know anything about it, but it's similar to your friend. She just intuitively could tell that something awful had happened there.
Yeah.
Which it did. There was a genocide, basically, one of the only successful genocides. They'd got rid of them all, the lot of them. Now I would like to move to another modern thing that because it's an interesting thing I have as well, an influence from Nietzsche. I read Nietzsche when I was young and it was influential on me. I am not a Nietzschean. I go against Nietzsche in lots of his basic assumptions because he's opposing Plato. And I believe in the sacred, and I believe that there's an order and meaning to the universe, which I think Nietzsche doesn't believe. And that is why he opposes Plato so much. But you quote Nietzsche in relation to D'Annunzio and Pound as well, and you quote him, including at the in the way that he defines pagans as those who say yes to life, which is a lovely quote, and I think it has some power to it. But I'm not sure it encompasses an actual functional definition of what pagans are. But it's definitely poetic. Do you think that Nietzsche can also be an obstruction to the transcendent? And Nietzscheanism is dangerous for people trying to rediscover the European soul, which is like the point of your book, right? What is the role of Nietzschean thought in the rediscovery of the European soul?
Very good question. I, of course, also read Nietzsche when I was far too young. So grew up reading Nietzsche, basically. So I have a soft spot for him from a very young age. I think he was very wise in many things, but the spiritual traditions he didn't know that much about. I don't think he was very knowledgeable about these things. I think there's a thing that is often overlooked in him, which is like the greatest thing about Nietzsche isn't necessarily always his sort of analytical part. It's kind of like his spirit, because there is this very vital, and I would say kind of pagan spirit, at least in this sort of antique Greek sense of the word. There is this kind of pagan sense of a fury in him. And I think it is this spirit that people can resonate with a lot.
Like
I think
Callicles, he reminds me of Callicles. Some of these, the people who, in the Gorgias, who are arguing against Plato's or Socrates. So he is a classical figure in that sense, but not one that's widely recognized now.
Yeah, and I think there's something about why I included that classic yes to life thing, because I think it does have a lot to do with paganism. Because as pagans, I think we say yes to the inevitable tragedy of life as well. We're kind of saying yes to all of it. This affirmative way of saying life is good and life is meaningful, although suffering and tragedy are inevitable, and we will face those things, but we will face them with heroism. And this heroic this heroic affirmation of life, that is an ultimate pagan value in my sense. I think that's one of the fundamental things that separates us from all the Abrahamic traditions, is the affirmation of life, that we say, yes, it is, there is suffering, there is tragedy, you cannot escape any of these things, but you say yes to all of it anyway. And I couldn't find a better heroic, kind of definition of the pagan spirit, because that is really what sort of separates us in some ways from a lot of these other things. It's not a passive and apathetic and submissive position, I think, to be a pagan. It does involve like strife, and Nietzsche's embracing of almost like a metaphysical struggle or strife to existence, I think, is something it's ultimately pagan. But you know, he
Count Kalergi called him the only heathen moralist, and I think he was onto something there because. And he said, I can't remember which book he wrote, like, if you had the opportunity to live your life all over again from the beginning, every single failure, every single pain and suffering, would you have the courage to say yes? And that is actually very like the, it's not the exact same, but the Celts and the other pagans in Europe believed in, metempsychosis, the transmigration of souls. That means coming back and doing it all over again. And they wanted that. It's not like the Indians they're aiming to escape samsara. They just wanted to come back again. Just like, so Nietzsche is, in a sense, like Kalergi said, a heathen moralist, even if he wasn't theologically heathen.
Yes. And people also, I think, misunderstand his ideas a little bit when he talks about the death of God. It's not like it's a great thing. He's talking about the disappearance of the transcendental sort of underlying metaphysical foundation of the civilization that we live in as Europe and the West to a larger extent. And it's not, people are like, yeah, that's great that God is that. He's like, no, Nietzsche is not saying that is great at all. That is the fundamental problem, to which his solution is that we should become the overman, which is hybris, in my view. I don't think it's that easy. And I think that we need to have a little bit of more we need to be a little bit more humble than that and approach the divine a little bit more humble way, because it is a little bit like Icarus,
Prometheus. Evelo, I think, is great because he is, unlike other traditionalists, he accepted the genius of Nietzsche and appreciated it, while also recognizing the failure of it, which is that it has no transcendental, has no nothing to lift it up out of. But if an Übermensch can come, it has to be really through a transcendental experience of life. And this saying yes to life comes as a natural consequence of pagan beliefs. It can't be a substitute for pagan beliefs, just saying yes to what, to sort of, there's a kind of nihilism there. But Nietzsche had the idea of the will to power, and this respectful will is there in heathenry. With Odin's brother, Will is an essential, Vili is an essential component in the creation at the beginning. So I think that, Nietzsche can be, as you have done in your book, integrated into an idea of the holiness of Europe and the rediscovery of the holy in Europe. Although there are some, you have to be careful not to.
Absolutely, you have to be very intellectually careful, and because it can lead you to a very sort of just a maze of sort of deconstruction, which is not healthy at all. But I've always liked the spirit of Nietzsche. It's this Dionysian fury that he has, and it really touches you. Especially I guess as a young man, it did. I often carried I had a pocket edition of Thus Spake Zarathustra that I had bought from Oxford, and it was tiny little Bible, and I used to carry that on hikes and stuff. And it's incredible writing. It's incredible stuff and
seductive.
Yeah.
I read it when I was about 21. I read Beyond Good and Evil, and immediately read Thus Spake Zarathustra afterwards. And it was the only thing I talked or thought about at the time. Very, very, very influential on me as a young man. You met some really fascinating characters, as well as having friends and your partner, wife now travel with you. But I find that very interesting because when I was a younger man, I used to travel a lot, and I used to find it quite providential what characters would pop up, almost like it was fated. And that does seem to be the case with the characters that you meet on your journeys too, especially the doctor from Questenberg. Do you allow fate when you're traveling to just sort of carry your feet towards these fated meetings?
Yeah, I think these are the treasures one finds. Because when you seek things, you're not going to find material objects, but you are going to find connections. And I mean, you're ultimately looking for connections. And how do you find that besides these places is through the living people that you meet by happenstance. And and you need guides to sort of take you into If you visit a foreign culture, whether you're Europe, even if you're European, you're not. It's not your cult. It's difficult to access. But if you find a guide, who can take you like Vergilius takes, Dante through the infernal. Like, you have to have a guide who takes you to places. So that's your key. And and you have to keep your eyes open and your senses open to the figures you meet.
And are you still in touch with the Doctor of Questenberg?
Yes. And
that's he for those who've not read the book yet, you meet first at, and this is something actually in several parts of the book we haven't gone over, besides artists and holy places, holy events are a big part of the book. You have in Lithuania the midsummer pagan rituals, and in Germany you go to some May rituals and erections of these kind of something that appears to be an Irminsul derived tradition. And it was one of these that this doctor appeared with, who were very knowledgeable of the history, and then took you to other places in Germany to see more of the same.
Yes. I mean, this is the thing. In Germany, it's almost illegal to just research things that have to do with some of these symbols of the past. And I'm not talking about the swastikas or something, but just the sun wheels and these pagan motifs. It's a difficult thing to research these things, and I have to keep the identity of this person, hidden because of the real repercussions that might cause him. But and that tells you so much about Germany, and things have happened after I wrote about that there, which I find stunning. That, for instance, that the police, I think a year ago during this Questenfest, which is this celebration in, I think, late May, so pretty soon now, in Pingst, during which this kind of tree-like structure on top of a hill by a tiny village has a wreath on it, so it becomes like a sun wheel shaped. It's a sun wheel pillar, and the wreath is replaced with a new wreath, and this happens yearly. And so the people wake up in the middle of the night before the sun rises, and they go to the top of the mountain. And as the sun rises behind this pillar, they sing this song to the rising sun. It's a very sort of pagan folkish custom, at least in its atmosphere. And then they replace the wreath, which is a very pagan motive of like replacing the green wreath. But what happened there a year ago was that the police raided the restaurant of the Questenfest, the only restaurant in the village. We're talking about a village that is very remote, run by a very, very nice older lady. And this is her one time of year that she can actually make money on this restaurant because it's crowded with people. And then the SWAT team turns up, because I was just there in December, and I talked to her at length about this because I wanted to get it right. And they raided this place and threatened her with all kinds of immaterial things, like hinting at threatening, because they suspected that there might be musicians, far-right musicians there. That was but that you can't shut down a restaurant because of its clientele might be holding wrong opinions or something. It's very, very. It's like the totalitarian stuff does exist, and it exists in Germany in these kinds of ways. And I will write about this because I was shocked that nobody had written about this in the past. So this is just a short thing to say that it's not easy to upkeep these traditions either when you have the force of the law actively trying to shut things down, which involve a local community. This is not Echtenstein. This is not some big state-funded thing. This is a little local community, and the highlight of the community is this ritual in May that happens every year. That's the highlight that's the center of the whole village. And if you disrupt that, then people will self-censor. People will not come because they're afraid of getting into trouble and stuff. So yeah, it is horrible what is happening in some of these places.
If anyone's not aware how overzealous the German state is about these kind of symbols, it was a few years ago. I think it was actually like more than 20 years ago. The police raided a left-wing anti-fascist record label, punk label, because they were selling anti-swastika signs. So there's or like people throwing swastikas in the bin. But even having the swastika in the context of an anti-Nazi thing was enough for them to get raided by the police. Like they are extremely overzealous and paranoid about anything with the symbols associated with the National Socialists, even things that are historical and native traditions, such that, like, I did a video recently on the history of the swastika, collaborated with help from a professor in Germany who had to, of course, remain completely anonymous because he can't even talk about it. Only in Scandinavia can they talk about the use of these symbols in Germany because the German state's insane, completely crazy about it. But I didn't know about them raiding that poor restaurateur's establishment.
Yeah, so please, everybody, this is the image on the cover of the book. Please go there, and when you eventually go to this place, if you go there, do visit that restaurant and eat there and like support them because they do need it. And without her having this little inn that people can stay in and keep in this restaurant, it's very unlikely that this tradition will go on, to be honest. But yeah, it's one of the themes of the book. Why the Question Fest, the Question Baum, the Question Tree is on the cover of the book, because this is really the central theme of my whole book, is this central pillar, this tree of life, which takes many forms throughout the European pantheons, but represents the central axis and structure around which the spiritual order should be oriented. And everything should move around this axis, this center. And I find that the center has been lost, but it's manifested in culture, in images, in symbolism, and sometimes in concrete representations of a pillar, as such as in the case of Germany, in the Questenbaum, in the Tree of Life, in this pillar, which stands on top of a mountain. And this is a symbol of something larger than simply this village. It is a symbol of the central sort of ordering principle, which has been lost to most people. And when these places are approached is during holy times. So this is the second theme of the book, and also why I've structured certain chapters, like the last chapter is chaptered around all the holy times of a year in Finland, is because this is the time that we can connect with the transcendent. Because not all time, just like not all places are the same, not all time is the same. There are certain places which are marked by the presence of the divine in nature, and we commune with the transcendent, with the gods, and with each other during those times. And those are the times that we are connected with something timeless, beyond our own sort of time-bound form. And it's always the same place, and it's always the same time, in a way, in the holy time, because it is this primal time which is marked by the presence of the gods and the activity of the gods. So it's not just like any time, but there are specific times.
Definitely. I have this something of a dilemma myself with these, because I love to attend these ancient folk custom traditions here in the West Country. I'm lucky that many of them survive, from singing to the apple trees to make them fruitful, and the maid traditions and things. But we, as in Lithuania and Germany and other parts of Europe where these wonderful traditions survive, many of them are quite secularized, or like they're Christianized, or sometimes I think this might be worse, they have been rehabilitated into a consciously neo-pagan version of themselves, and that actually ends up distorting them, because they're trying to be what they think is pagan, because some anthropologist 100 years ago told them, oh, this custom's actually of pagan origin. So then, knowing that, they think, oh, we will lead into that and make it what they think is pagan, actually might make it less authentic than it was. But what I end up doing often is, me and my hearth, we do our rituals around that time of year as a separate thing with just believing heathens. And then we also attend these public events where most of the people are not really heathen, but we because it's a holy time of year, those events themselves are so imbued with the holy because of their long-lasting tradition. It's good to attend them, but it's not quite the same thing as attending an actual religious event with heathens. What do you think? Do you think which is preferable, that they should be maintained in their secular form, or should they be transformed into religious events again?
That's a good question. I think, of course, if the secular event can sort of find its deeper meaning or a deeper dimension, that's good. And I obviously if these things somehow can be infused with more of a sense of their actual sacred meaning, then I'm all for that. But of course, they should also be maintained as separate. I mean, that's what we can do in these smaller ways, is to maintain their integral essence.
If I recall, you did perform a blot at the Question Fest, but you waited until everyone had gone away. Is that if I remember correctly? One of them, like you
every time I go to, so people are like sometimes they're like, there's too much toasting in this book, and it's because
it's important.
Yeah, this is because when you go to a place, you do want to, having traveled a long way, you want to have a moment where you can approach that place with reverence and respect and offer it your words and a libation and a gift. And sometimes it's difficult to do if there's German Schlager music playing and people are eating sausages, like you have to sometimes communicate with those places in other times, to have that sense. But I think it's important that we, when we visit these sites, that it's not just like we view them as intellectual or cultural things, but also try to like have a moment when you approach it with reverence and let the place speak. Don't put meanings on it. Don't put your ideas onto it. Just be there, raise a toast, say a greeting, say a prayer or a invocation of some sort, and be open to whatever is there and try to have an experience of it. Try to be open. I know it's difficult for us as moderns because for us, thoughts, words, symbols, ideas come first. But if you try to just for a little while put that aside and try to be open to whatever experience there might be, I think we can have a richer sense of those places. For instance, if you go to a place that's a sacred river or a sacred, place, don't just go look. If you know that there's like a sacred pool there, don't just look at the pool. Take off your clothing and go and take a dip in the pool. Like, engage with the place as our ancestors would have engaged with that place.
Wise words. Thank you very much, Aki. I think what you've described is a path by which, if followed, people may rediscover the holiness of Europe. And I just want to finish off with asking you what's next. You're now are you going to write another book?
Well, I've been doing this for a decade now. I've been doing more and more of rituals having to do with rites of passage. So name givings, wedding ceremonies, and also passing into the next world, funerals, and then these calendar rites, holy rites of the year, just to sort of maintain the cosmic axis in this way, just to keep up this tradition or give it some vitality. So I've been really engaged with this kind of work, which is a little different than the writing, because in the writing it's my subjective experience, and I put a lot of my own flawed personality in there. But in this holy work, I do try to rise up beyond whatever I am and what I think, and try to offer a service to people who ask me for it and who seek it. And I do that in the context of the Finnish tradition, but in a larger scale in sort of terms of a Nordic approach to things, where we obviously don't have any preserved rights as such given to us, but we have enough elements of the rights that we know what to do at specific times of year, what to offer and to whom, and with what words and deeds. So I try to do those things, and it's also part of my work, is to try to do that. And yes, then I'm editor of this sort of literary book anthology, where I have other writers and artists contribute, and it's also a lot relating to this subject matter that we're talking about. So spiritual traditions, culture, art, philosophy, poetry, and try to have like a publication that has a little bit more unusual focus in this way and rooted more in tradition. And yes, I am writing the next book at the moment, which will kind of be a continuation of Holy Europe in a way. It's I'm also visiting places and trying to explore a specific kind of spiritual tendency, which I mentioned to you earlier, which has to do with the northernness and with the whatever the North represents, because the North often in the Finnish tradition, and I would say in the wider sense in the other traditions as well, the North is the direction of great secrets and power and the great beyond, but it's also the direction of danger and risk and such things. And I think we as people of the North, many of us are sort of by nature sort of oriented towards the North in a mythic and magical sense. And so I'm exploring this sort of idea of what the Northern soul is and how it manifests both in me and in culture and in our time and what it actually points towards. So I'm further developing the ideas that I explore in Holy Europe. So it's really the third part of my book.
I look forward very much to reading that, Aki, and I wish you all the best in your work as a priest in Finland. And I thank you very much for joining us today for the Jive book review on Jive Talk.
And thank you. Yeah, and thank you very much. And I've been a long time follower of your work, and I've enjoyed it immensely. And I read every year at Yule time. I read your book to my daughter, so it's a little yearly tradition to read that book to her. So yeah, thank you for your great work as well. It was great being here.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, everyone, thanks very much for watching. This has been Jive Talk. Are you interested in worshipping the gods of ancient England and Scandinavia, but you're not sure how to do it? Starting Heathenry is a ritual-focused online course which will furnish you with the knowledge and confidence to practice the heathen religion, alone or with others. The course teaches you how to construct heathen prayers for yourself, not according to the established rites of any modern group, but according to what historical sources show. Starting Heathenry assumes you're interested in Germanic paganism, know about the gods and myths, and want to begin practicing this religion, but require guidance on how to do so. It is based on a micro-learning structure, which is proven to improve knowledge retention by up to 80% in students compared to other learning methods. You get more than 5 hours of learning material, bit by bit, as you please. A modern method of learning about an ancient religion. Your path to knowing the gods through ritual starts here.